Well, let's just take a look at another issue that's got ramifications here and overseas. Well, and it reaches too into some of the highest political realms in both countries. And that's, of course, the scandal involving former British Prime Minister David Cameron and Australian businessman Lex Greensill. It's a scandal that seems to be getting deeper, with Mr Cameron forced to deny claims he abused his political connections to gain favours for Greensill, whose supply chain financing company Greensill Capital collapsed earlier this year. But it's not just David Cameron tangled up in this Greensill web. There's plenty of Australian connections here as well. To help me get to the bottom of it all, I'm joined from London by the Europe correspondent for the Australian newspaper, Jacquelin Magnay. Jacquelin, thank you for your time. It's been a huge issue in the UK. It's not been reported in any great detail here in Australia. That's why I wanted to get you on the show tonight, and thank you. What's the link with David Cameron and Greensill Capital?
Well, there are very extensive links. Lex Greensill, an Australian financier based from Bundaberg, he was at the centre of 10 Downing Street for several years, advising the government on supply chain finance when David Cameron was Prime Minister. Then when David Cameron left 10 Downing Street after the Brexit referendum, he was then employed by Greensill as an advisor, and in the last few years, David Cameron was able to access Lex Greensill and link him with the senior levels of government. And we're talking about the Health Minister, Matt Hancock. He contacted the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, to try and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of loans and money, taxpayer money, during the COVID crisis. And there's big question marks about the transparency of this and how David Cameron was able to pick up the phone, send a few texts and organise lunches with senior government ministers, and the transparency about this. David Cameron admits he made a mistake, that he perhaps didn't follow the proper processes. But there are links to this and parallels, because Julie Bishop, our former foreign minister, was also involved in Greensill as an advisor, and she joined in December 2019. And then within about 6 weeks, she'd organised a meeting between Lex Greensill and Matthias Cormann, the finance minister at the time, at the Davos World Economic Forum in early 2020. And of course, there's question marks because Ms Bishop was not registered as a lobbyist until April in 2020, her company at that time. And what was she doing, and where is the register and record of that meeting and what went on in that meeting? And I think there's just a few question marks there that we need to know the processes that were involved and what happened and what influence she had. I mean, there's nothing wrong. I mean, it's great that governments are reaching out to outside influences to find out how things operate in the world, but I think there's just a big question mark about the public knowing that this is happening.
Yeah, and look, former ministers have a period, a window under the guidelines when they depart the job, that they are not allowed to operate inside any part of a portfolio for which they had carriage, and that sort of timing, to my mind, would mean Bishop was inside that window. It's interesting, David Cameron says he only met Lex Greensill twice only when he was Prime Minister. But how does it square with the revelations that Greensill actually had a desk at 10 Downing Street and a business card and a title that said he was a senior advisor to the PM? That, like the Bishop, connection to Matthias Cormann in Davos, doesn't really square with when she came on the books as a lobbyist. This is pretty murky.
It's really murky, especially because David Cameron, at a small business function, introduced Lex Greensill from the crowd and said, "Hi, Lex, give us a wave." So he clearly knew who he was. He clearly knew he was part of his team at the time. It's interesting that all of these connections are now emerging. David Cameron has only made a public statement about this 5 weeks after persistent questions by journalists about this matter. So clearly he wanted to get his story straight. He's checked all his facts of when he saw him and what he spoke to him about. Lex Greensill, he lives up in Cheshire. in a lovely little country town, and we have not seen or heard from him at all. He's gone completely to ground. The British government is now launching an inquiry into the matter, and Boris Johnson wants to know exactly what David Cameron knew and what happened during this lobbying period, which is in itself is quite interesting, given the relationship between those two men. It goes back to their Eton school days, and to have one Prime Minister now investigating another Prime Minister is a fascinating development.
And of course, we know that Lex Greensill, his proposal that allegedly went to Matthias Cormann, got knocked on the head. Matthias Cormann said it sounded like payday lending. That's how it's been reported. He knocked it back. Julie Bishop obviously wasn't influential on that score. And we know that Greensill's company was heavily involved in the Whyalla steelmaker, Sanjeev Gupta's business, and that looks like it's in trouble because of this capital collapse. So it's a really big issue. Jackie, stay across it. We'll read everything you've got to say in The Australian, and maybe there might be some Australian-based investigations into this mess, not just in Britain. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.